What happened in the motorcade route?
The President of the United States is dead.
Considering the number of enemies that he had, Lord knows they had reasons to get rid of him.
And I know that her face is down like this. She pushed him down and crawled out over the back to get a piece of skull off the back of the car.
Turned out that he left his tape recorder going when he left the room.
That bullet then traversed and moved backward. And then you do have the shot from the rear that struck him in the back, and I think there was another shot that hit him in the back of the head.
It didn't make any sense why one guy who suddenly went from having fired a rifle since the Marine Corps and suddenly was able to pull off world-class precision.
Was there a real thread of that fear running through the administration that perhaps a coup could take place?
He and Kenny O'Donnell were told they had to change their stories for the good of the country. He had to basically lie about what he saw.
Colin, would you like to tell the folks about the magic bullet?
Okay. You've got a throat wound to the president's neck, which from the doctors in Dallas all cohesively said the same thing when they wrote their reports independently the afternoon of the assassination, was an anterior, meaning frontal shot. Mm-hmm. One called it penetrating, others called it fragment wound that exuded blood, another one called it slowly. Then they get him to the autopsy at Bethesda, and they realize, oh, we've got a bullet hole in the back of the president's body. So they located that hole, and Dr. George Gregory Berkeley, the president's personal physician, signed a medical certificate of death for the District of Columbia that read, with a penetrating wound at the level of the third thoracic vertebrae. Now, cervical vertebrae is neck. Thoracic means chest. Third thoracic vertebrae means between the third and fourth rib. Now, if you want to take a cutaway of a human body with the skeletal and some of the organs in place, you'll discover that if that bullet going in between the third and fourth rib, it entered the torso, it would have struck the president's heart. But it didn't. It stopped short and bruised the pleura. It caused what we call an ecchymosis, a bruise on the pleura.
And it didn't penetrate.
It did not penetrate beyond that. And this is borne out in FBI documentation and everything else. Now, what happened was you got a hole in the president's throat, which the doctors in Dallas have told the men at Bethesda the day after the assassination was in fact a bullet wound. And then you've got a back wound in the chest area, which is lower than the bullet wound in the throat. Now, the problem is, if you're going to acknowledge that the president did not turn around in his seat in the car during the shooting, the problem is now, between the autopsy physicians and the Dallas physicians, you have bullet wounds from behind and bullet wounds from the front. So you have two, at least, separate sources of fire. Now, it's interesting to note that Life magazine, which purchased the print and film rights to the Zapruder film before November 29, 1963, who owned this film and had already published several frames of the Zapruder film and knew that the president had never turned around, attempted to marry this information on behalf of the government in their first issue of December 1963 by saying that it's evident from the films that the president had more or less turned around in his car and exposed his throat to the building behind him, allowing for this shot. So this is how far the media went to correspond with what the government was trying to shovel up. Now, the other problem is that if Oswald's shooting down at an angle of 30 to 45 degrees from behind and above the president, and he strikes the president in the back, the throat wound is too high to align for that type of trajectory. In fact, it's about 3 or 4 inches too high. The other problem is the FBI has the Oswald rifle, or what's attributed to Oswald, and they also have access to a copy of the Zapruder film. Now, they sat down and they studied the film, and they counted off the frames between the first time that anybody in the car was shot and the last time anybody was shot, which to what the best they could ascertain is 313, which is where the president gets the headshot. And they determined that there were X numbers of frames. Then they determined that Zapruder's camera was set to operate at about 18.3 frames per second. So they took the number of frames exposed during the shooting when the men in the car are being wounded, and they divided it by the number of frames that the camera was set to operate at shutter speed. And they determined that the shooting in which anybody in the car was shot From the first shot that struck the president to the last shot that struck the president, including the shots that hit Governor Connolly, it's 5.7 to 5.9 seconds had elapsed. That's all the time allowed for on the film in the time that those two men are wounded. Then they took the Oswald gun with 100 rounds of ammunition, and their best super sharpshooters in the FBI tried firing at horizontal, that's to say on the flat, level targets, stationary targets, meaning they weren't moving. And the best that any of them were able to fire that weapon, the best they could do was 3 shots in that amount of time. So they figured, okay, all we have time for is 3 shots. So the problem is, frame 313 shows President Kennedy being struck in the head, and that bullet hits nobody else. And they also have to acknowledge, come the spring of 1964, that a bystander named James Tague got hit by a ricochet, a bullet off of concrete down by the overpass.
So that's
shot number 2. The problem is you still have President Kennedy's back wound, his throat wound, and 5 wounds in Governor Connolly that you have to account for. And the problem is if you're going to stick with the lone assassin using the 6.5 Carcano rifle, you've only got time for 1 more shot. So you have to somehow account for that. And a senator named Arlen Specter, who at that time was a assistant DA, I believe, junior legal counsel to the Warren Commission, and Arlen Specter, with the assistance of a few other people, came up with most implausible concepts, now what we call the single bullet theory. And what he's saying is that the president was shot not in the back of the chest, but the bullet actually entered his neck, and it transited his neck, exited the throat. It continued on to inflict a back wound, a chest wound, 2 wrist wounds, and a thigh wound in Governor Connolly through several layers of clothing, in some cases smashing bone, 5 inches of the governor's 5th rib, also the distal end of his right radius, his wrist bone, and also his left femur in his upper leg. And yet this bullet somehow miraculously emerged completely unscathed and basically pristine. And it's entered in official evidence as Commission Exhibit 399. We also call it the stretcher bullet because it was found on a stretcher in the corridor at Parkland in the emergency department by a man named Daryl Tomlinson. I mean, it's even questionable whether that bullet's even the one that was entered as evidence, whether it's even the same one. The government, their entire hypothesis is Oswald is the lone assassin using a 22-year-old, or actually his was a little bit older than that. His was a 1940, so his was 23 years. Mine's a 1941. Using an antique, as the FBI called it, a rusty, heavily worn, heavily oiled weapon, had somehow successfully gotten off 3 shots in record time and had successfully hit 2 victims, including delivering death by a fatal head wound to the principal victim.
Colin, have you ever tried to recreate the shooting yourself within 6 seconds?
I dry-fired my weapon on television for them. Now, dry firing is without using live rounds. I can get off 3 shots in about 5 seconds. The problem is you need about 2 to 2.5 seconds for what we call the mechanical operating time, which is to recycle, to pull the bolt out, to eject the spent shell, and get the next shell in the breech or in the firing chamber. But in addition to that, you've got a car retreating at a distance of 235 feet or 215 feet to 300 feet, moving away from you at 12 miles an hour, and you have to reacquire the target in your telescopic sight before you can even try to line up to shoot again. The other thing is when you dry fire a rifle, you're not firing under realistic conditions. If you put live rounds in, which I have done as well, the brass tends to swell just a little bit in the breech, and when you try and pull that bolt back to eject the spent shell, it'll come out quite easily, but it doesn't come out quite as easily as it would if you were ejecting a live round. There's a little bit of drag. It takes a little bit of extra practice and a little bit more pull, and you've got to take your face away from the rifle, because when you pull the bolt back, the length that's going to be forward of your cheek, at least 6 inches during the shooting, is going to come back. I think it's about 4 to 4.5 inches into your face, so you need to move your head out of the way to manually operate that bolt. Like people say, if this really happened, it was a complete fluke, and the guy managed to successfully pull off a feat of unparalleled and basically without comparison, nothing else like it in the world. I mean, he really lucked out. The problem for that theory, of course, is that you have in print, which has been available for the public since September 1964, you have the medical submissions of the doctors in Dallas, which is one of my areas of expertise, and then you also have even the aftermath of not only what they know from the autopsy, but how everything got changed after Oswald died on Sunday, November 24th.
Folks, we're speaking with Colin McSween tonight. We're talking about his book, At the Door of Memory, Aubrey Reich and the Assassination of President Kennedy, which can be obtained by going to www.jfklancer.com. And you can also go to Amazon.com and pick it up there. You also have a connection with the X-Files, which I was a big fan of that show.
Oh, yeah.
Would you like to...
story behind that?
Yeah, you want to just tell folks about that?
Like, you ask me anything, it's going to become a long answer. But anyhow, I was... first time I consulted in drama was for a Broadway production called Les Miserables, and that was in the area of cosmetics and certain effects they were trying to achieve, and that was an area that I was quite gifted in. 1993, I was contacted by what is now Global Television on the 30th anniversary of the assassination. They wanted to do a television special, so we ended up taping a big segment for the evening news here. Get back to the wound on the throat. 4 doctors, here's what they said pertaining to the external data, what the front of the neck told them when looking at it. Dr. James Carrico, the first physician to see the president when he was brought into the trauma room, said there was one small penetrating wound. Now, I shouldn't have to pull out a dictionary to tell you what penetrating means. This is the first man to see him. He says it's a small penetrating wound. It's interesting to note Jackie Kennedy said after the first shot, she looked at her husband, he had his hands to his throat, there was a quizzical look on his face, but there was no blood. Now, if that's an exit wound, no way that the best starch collar and tie knot in the world would have kept that wound closed. That would have been one big gusher if that had been an exit wound that had gone through the president's neck from a bullet entering from behind. You've got Jackie Kennedy saying there was no blood, and you've got Dr. Carrico saying one small penetrating wound. Dr. Malcolm Perry, who helped perform the tracheostomy, said there was a small wound anteriorly. It was exuding blood slowly. Exuding is a word used to describe sweating. Kind of bleed you get from a needle stick or a pinprick or when you step on a nail. Now, the only difference is with all of those other exceptions, the projectile that causes the wounds gets pulled back out. So, in fact, your bleeding from a nail wound is going to be a little bit worse than what we're describing here. Dr. Baxter said there was considerable contusion of the muscles of the anterior neck, well, sort of a closed, puckered, indented wound with the same type of bleeding that we're talking about. Okay, Dr. Robert McClelland said there was a fragment wound of the trachea. Fragment is something very, very tiny. On the phone over the weekend when Dr. James Humes was talking to Dr. Perry told him, he says, this wound was 3.5 to 5 millimeters in diameter and no bigger. Humes actually wrote that down, and those notes survived the other notes that got burnt in his fireplace. So not all the notes got burned. Some of them survived, and some of them are very telling. The other thing is here you got a very tiny entry wound penetrating from the front. Then listen to what they said about the internal data, what they observed as they were trying to do the cupped endotracheal tube before they did the tracheostomy. Dr. Carrico inserted an endotracheal tube and while doing so noted a ragged wound of the trachea immediately below the larynx. Dr. Clark said that. Now, when you study a cutaway of the trachea and you study how an endotracheal tube moves, it glides down the inside of the front side of the trachea. That's where it encountered this blast tissue that had been blasted inward. Small wound on the outside with a blast to the inside. This is encountered and seen visually through the pharyngoscope by Dr. Carrico, noted also by Dr. Clark.
Frontal wound.
Yeah. Considerable quantities of blood were present from the president's oral pharynx. This means the throat at the back of the mouth. Considerable quantities of blood because of the lacerated trachea. Dr. Clark noted that. Very little bleeding, exuding on the outside at the front. Very heavy hemorrhaging on the inside. Through the laryngoscope, a ragged wound of the trachea was seen immediately below the larynx. Dr. Carrico said that. Then you've got Dr. McClelland, who said there was pneumothoracis. Now, pneumothoracis means air in the chest. This is free air in the chest, in an area where it shouldn't be. Air is normally in the airway in the lungs, but it's not free in the chest. Exactly. That's going to cause your lungs to collapse. So you've got pneumothoracis, and he says this was secondary to the tracheomediastinal injury. So you got upper mediastinal and chest injury from this entry wound. And then it also goes on to say there was also obvious tracheal and chest damage. Dr. Jenkins, the anesthesiologist, said that. So here you've got a very small wound of entry, a penetrating, fragmentary wound, exuding blood, and then you've got all this interior damage causing them very significant respiratory problems.
Now, I guess we should explain to the audience that may be a little bit perplexed of why we're going on about this entrance wound to his throat. Because
the reason it's significant is because You study any pieces of film of the assassination, the entire time of the shooting has his back to what's supposed to be the source of the shot. The shots were allegedly coming from the southeast corner 6th floor window of the book depository, which is between 235, I believe, and 300 feet behind the president's location. So if Oswald or whoever else was shooting from the book depository were shooting at the president, any shots that struck the president from that location would have hit him in the back. It's arguably defensible that the back wound that was noted that hit him in the torso and the back of the chest, which they saw at the autopsy in Bethesda, that shot did come somewhere from behind. Governor Connolly was hit somewhere from behind. The key thing with President Kennedy was that the throat wound was an anterior. It was a frontal wound. The source and the shot and everything else came from the front. The head wound also had to have come from the front because the exit was out the back.
Folks, if you're just joining us, we're speaking with Colin McSween. Colin McSween is a JFK researcher. He's an author. He's released a terrific book. He's been telling us some stories from it tonight. It's At the Door of Memory. It's the story of Aubrey Reich and the assassination of President Kennedy. Phenomenal. I feel riveted to this chair, and I feel like I've just been right through the assassination. I've been drawn right into Trauma Room 1, where President Kennedy's body was delivered. They tried to resuscitate him. We're discussing some of the various wounds to the body, to the head, and what the doctors have said concerning that. What was Aubrey's reaction when the Warren Commission came out and they were talking that there was very little in the way of damage to the back of the head? Did he have any concern about that?
I don't know that he ever read the Warren report. He has sometimes reflected at the possibility, a headshot and the damage that he felt in the back. He says, I guess it's conceivable that might have been caused by a rear shot. Now, he has said that to me a number of times. I guess it's possible. I know myself from all my years in mortuary work, working with the coroner's service and by contract and so on, that you do sometimes get wounds to different parts of the body that are sometimes difficult to ascertain whether you're dealing with an entry or an exit. And I would say that he was at somewhat of a disadvantage in that what he felt was through the sheet. And even though he used the term blasted out feeling, that I'm just leaving some room that, that if he was on here telling you the story himself, that he feels, well, that's a possibility. As I say, his big drawback was that he didn't have the advantage of being able to observe the entire head. The large part for Aubrey where any line of suspicion in this whole thing at all really kind of began for him in the late 1970s, and when David S. Lifton approached him in his research on his huge voluminous book called Best Evidence, which I still highly recommend to people. I think it's a must-read if they've read nothing else on the assassination and they want to get into some of the story between the contradictions between Dallas and Bethesda and some of the problems with the bypassing of the jurisprudence and jurisdiction of Dallas County in the case. Best Evidence probably addresses those concerns better than anything that I've read. But it was during his interviews between some of the witnesses who were at the Bethesda hospital autopsy of President Kennedy later that evening, was when Lifton was approaching those individuals and approaching some of the individuals that were present and in the trauma room at Parkland. It's very compelling because the tribute written by Lifton, which is contained in this book, and it's quite lengthy, goes into quite a lot of detail about Aubrey's reaction to exactly the type of questions that you're addressing.
Was that the first time somebody had brought those issues up to him?
As far as I know, yes.
Oh, really, eh? In the late 70s?
Yeah.
Huh.
But, I mean, one must remember, Aubrey went from driving ambulance, I believe about a year later or so, he left the ambulance service. He went to work for a while with a bakery, and then he went to work for a couple of years with a professional car company delivering professional vehicles from their plant in Ohio down to different cities in Texas. In 1967, our big centennial year here, Aubrey joined the Highland Park Police Department and remained in law enforcement then for much of the next 30-some years. So I think because of his professional involvement and his commitment to law enforcement, he pretty much steered clear through, from a lot of this. But as I say, I think it was largely the discussion and the information put before him in interviews with Lifton, especially the first interview that David Lifton conducted with Aubrey, when Aubrey first became aware that there were some serious, glaring
discrepancies
problems.
Was he ever called before the Warren Commission or the House Select Committee on Assassinations? To your best knowledge?
I feel pretty dumb that way. At the moment, I'm going to say no, because I don't think that he was. I know that the federal government were aware of him for a long time because he's mentioned by name and in full 6-point capitals in the documents, the FBI documents, as pertains to the Belknap situation in terms of epileptic seizure case. As far as I know, no, he was not called by them. I know that he was approached and interviewed by Jim Garrison, and I know that he was, in fact, approached and had been talked to by various people down through the years. But I think the major issues involving discrepancies between what was observed at Parkland and what was observed at Bethesda first came to his attention in his interviews when Mr. Lifton first approached him.
Maybe you could tell people a little bit of your background and what got you started in the JFK assassination as a researcher.
Okay, it was Friday, November 22nd, 1963. I just turned 9 years old on the 17th of October. I happened to be home recovering from a bout with the flu. I was lying in my parents' bed. My mother came into the room. It was about 10:30 Vancouver time, where we were living in North Van at the time, and she came in, and I woke up when she entered the room, and she broke the news to me of the shooting. I sat up, and she said, if you want to come listen to the news, you can come stand with your father. And we got the radio on. Our TV was shot at the time, and we had no money to fix it, so we stood at the old RCA Victor and listened to the news for the next hour and a half or so until the rest of the kids came home from lunch. That's really where my interest began. My mother decided I was well enough to go to school for the afternoon, and we no sooner got there that the principal sent us home because the school was closed. And I assisted my older brother delivering newspapers that afternoon, and there were some snippets of information in the paper that I recall reading that same day, and some of the information that we were told over the radio within the first 90 minutes of the shooting. And some of that information just stuck in my brain. I couldn't get rid of the information, and it just nagged away at me for a number of years. But the time I was 11 years old or 12 years old, a couple years later, I began to slowly amass a library of my own on the assassination, which now numbers in the hundreds of volumes. A good many of them are autographed, as I've managed over the years to also encounter and meet with and confer with a number of the people that have written some of these books. I don't know how to describe it. It's not an obsession necessarily, because I have many aspects of involvement in my life that have many different interests. I've been told I'm a very eclectic individual, but this just happens to be one that, I would take an interest in it for a period of months, and then it would kind of wane a bit, and then a year or two later it would kind of come back again, and then through the 1970s, especially the late 70s and early 80s, it began to kind of take on a life all its own. The interest, at least in many circles, has not really died, so I remain as active as I can possibly be, and just this past week taught a 90-minute history class for a conjoined group of grade 12 history students over here at the Abbotsford Collegiate. We actually had Dr. Robert McClelland on Skype with us, and he addressed the group for about a half hour himself.
Can you tell the folks who are listening who Robert McClelland is?
Dr. Robert McClelland was in his second year as a professor of surgery at the Southwest Texas University, which joins the Parkland Hospital facility in Dallas, and he happened to be on hand that day on the second floor when he was approached by other physicians and told that the president had been shot and was being brought to Parkland. Dr. McClelland assisted in the medical emergency treatment of President Kennedy on the 22nd, as well as on Lee Harvey Oswald on Sunday the 24th of November.
You said you had him on Skype long distance. What were you guys talking about to the audience?
We discussed the assassination, the immediate aftermath, the arrival of the president in the trauma room at the hospital at Parkland in major medicine, some of the emergency medical procedures that were employed, which ultimately proved futile. They had to do what they could as long as there was any evidence of vital signs. So he addressed those issues, and then he also addressed the same information as pertains to their treatment of Lee Harvey Oswald 2 days later.
The best you can, Colin. Can you walk us through what Robert was talking about, what Dr. McClelland was talking about, and what took place in trauma room?
Well, he says that when he entered the room that a number of surgeons were already attending to the president, and he came to the head end of the table to assist with a procedure which is called a tracheostomy, which is where they make an opening in the anterior or front area of the throat to access the windpipe, which is scientifically known as a trachea, and they make an opening into the trachea to facilitate an airway for breathing. So he was assisting with that, and being at the head end of the carriage gave him quite an opportunity to examine the fatal wound that the president had sustained to the head, which is ultimately what took the president's life. Dr. McClelland and I have met previously. I actually had him autograph a set of notes from the Warren Report, which was published in September '64, and he autographed those notes for me, so I have that in my medical collection here at home. He's just a real gentleman, very gracious gentleman, very unassuming. He went on to talk about the time approached when it was pretty evident that the president had expired, that there was really nothing further that they could do. The fact that they had done everything that they could do, that they felt they could do, that they were equipped and trained to do. As he said, it was a massive fatal skull wound. They had to do what they could do to the best of their ability as long as there was any evidence or any chance of maintaining any level of vital signs. But he said, people just even today don't usually tend to survive that type of an injury.
Yeah, it was pretty massive to the head. Half his
head
was blown out of the back.
10 by 17 centimeters in overall dimensions.
Can we also talk a little bit about, in specific, the Warren Commission decided that actual wound in President Kennedy's throat, right below the Adam's apple, was actually an exit wound. I disagree with that finding, as I'm sure many JFK researchers do also. They feel, as I do, that it was an entrance wound. Can you tell us what Dr. McClelland said about that?
Well, Dr. McClelland really didn't comment much on that other than the fact that this was done to establish an airway. He did mention the fact that prior to his getting to the room that the other doctors had actually inserted what's called a cuffed endotracheal tube, which is sometimes referred to as an orotracheal tube. The difference between that type of procedure and a tracheostomy is an orotracheal tube is one that by virtue of the prefix oro means via the mouth. And what they tend to do is they pull the head upward, they pull the jaw upward to try and straighten as much as possible the access from the mouth down into the trachea. Then there's a plastic preset, I would call it, that goes in, and this preset actually helps to pull the epiglottis forward, which holds the trachea open. And then they insert a cuffed endotracheal tube, and it was during this procedure, actually, that Dr. Carrico discovered a ragged defect immediately below the vocal cords, which are inside of what we call the Adam's apple, or what's scientifically known as the thyroid cartilage. Now, Dr. McClelland mentioned that this had proven to be futile, that the respirations were inadequate, that the cuffed endotracheal tube wasn't working, and this is why they opted for the tracheostomy. Actually, there's a difference. Nowadays, we've gotten kind of lazy with our language, but in the early 60s and even into the 70s, there was a sharp difference in definition between the terms tracheostomy and tracheotomy. Now, spelling the two words, they're the same other than the letter S. And the difference between an otomy and an ostomy is an ostomy means a hole. So a tracheostomy means making a hole into the trachea to provide an airway for breathing. The medical dictionaries of that era and even into the 1970s indicate that a tracheotomy was an incision or a cutting made to remove foreign bodies or tissues or to collect biopsy specimens. So very different terminology, but as what happens in many cultures, our language has become very lazy, and for much of the past 30 or 35 years, people, even in medical circles, have gotten into the routine of using the two terms interchangeably. In the 60s and 70s, that wasn't the case. These were two very different terms, meaning two very different things. And what I find interesting is that the admission notes that were furnished by the emergency physicians at Parkland, they all unanimously called it a tracheostomy when they wrote their admission notes the afternoon of the assassination. So we're talking about an opening to provide an airway. An ostomy means a hole. A tracheostomy means a hole into the trachea. A tracheotomy means an absolute cutting and the removal of tissue. So we're talking about two different things. Now, what's interesting is that everybody at the autopsy at Bethesda called it a tracheotomy. You get into a whole other discussion there, but that's my reply, I suppose.
No, that's good. That's exactly what I was looking for. So we've got the president lying on the table in trauma room 1. He's just been declared dead. What happens next? I'm trying to bring Aubrey Reich into it.
Right. Well, Aubrey Reich's story very much interweaves with all of this because I think Aubrey basically took up a position outside in the corridor, right outside of Trauma 2, directly across about a 8-foot hallway from Mrs. Kennedy, and they were actually sitting about 4 or 5 feet apart for much of the remaining 15 or 20 minutes before 1 o'clock when the president's death was actually pronounced by Dr. Kemp Clark. Dr. Kemp Clark was the director of the Department of Neurological Surgery at Parkland at that time in 1963. And because of the nature of what was evidently the fatal wound to the head, it was pretty much decided that he should be the one that make the official pronouncement of death. At first, it was even discussed that maybe he would do the medical certificate of death. Now, I don't have enough information at my fingertips to say whether he did fill out a medical certificate of death or not. I do know that the one that was actually furnished for the purposes of having President Kennedy moved out of Dallas and returned to Washington was actually a certification of death that was signed by Justice of the Peace Theron Ward. Dr. Clark did pronounce the death, and he affixed the time of death as 1 o'clock. In Dr. Charles Crenshaw's book, he actually placed the time of death at about 12:52, so it's an 8-minute discrepancy. I've heard some people say that the reason for stretching the extra 8 minutes or so was to allow some time for some priests to arrive to administer the last rites of the Catholic Church. But, regardless, it's my understanding the president had actually expired at about 12:52 or 12:53. Dr. Clark affixed his signature to a pronouncement of death as at 1 p.m.
Thanks so much, folks, for listening to Night Fright. I'm your host, Brent Holland. See you next time.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
The President of the United States is dead.
Considering the number of enemies that he had, Lord knows they had reasons to get rid of him.
And I know that her face is down like this. She pushed him down and crawled out over the back to get a piece of skull off the back of the car.
Turned out that he left his tape recorder going when he left the room.
That bullet then traversed and moved backward. And then you do have the shot from the rear that struck him in the back, and I think there was another shot that hit him in the back of the head.
It didn't make any sense why one guy who suddenly went from having fired a rifle since the Marine Corps and suddenly was able to pull off world-class precision.
Was there a real thread of that fear running through the administration that perhaps a coup could take place?
He and Kenny O'Donnell were told they had to change their stories for the good of the country. He had to basically lie about what he saw.